What's that? Is that a thumb? Okay. All right. Good morning. Glad you're here this morning. We are going to continue our study on prayer. That's our topic this quarter. We were only able to, address some issues in regard to prayer. I wanted our last time that we met to sort of see what's in your head and your thoughts about prayer. So that's what we did. Had a lot of questions, so we didn't get to the full session. And it was interesting hearing, some of your personal experiences with prayer. So I want to sort of continue what I had on the docket for last week, and that is to look at the model prayer of Jesus, the two places where we find it. And I've got it entitled, A Guide to Help Us Pray, and that's the purpose, at least, that Jesus gave when he was asked by his disciples, teach us to pray. And so he provides what I think it's a guide. It's not something that that he meant for us to recite. Some early Christians in the Didache, which is an early writing that's extra biblical material, dates really early. There were some Christians who adopted the model prayer. They would say it 3 times a day, sort of like in parallel to Daniel and other Jews who used to pray 3 times a day. And so they used the model prayer for that. I gave you my experience that, the model prayer, we often said that before a track meet or a football game. And it's like we wanted to get the Lord on our side, team, so we would win. I remember that was the first time I had experienced the Lord's Prayer. I wasn't a Christian at the time, but I knew some things because I've heard it before. So I just remember the athletes, that I was with, they were saying it, and I was just, I didn't know all of the words of the Lord's Prayer. But anyway, that was my experience with the prayer, and it was more of, I think, asking God to give us, to let us perform at our highest level. So, and I don't have any problem with athletes or anybody that, gives recognition to God if they are able to do something, touchdown, or, win a meet or something like that. I think recognizing God and the talent that he has given to the individual is not a bad thing at all. But in regard to the model prayer, there are some aspects to it, I think, that are very important because it is a guide. And I think what I'd like to do is, what is it in the, model prayer? What is Jesus teaching us in regard to the components, the elements, the dynamic of prayer, however you want to think about it? There are some critical things. It might deal with attitude. Maybe the guide is indicating not necessarily what to say per se, but what attitudes and what issues are involved when we pray. So, Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 5, let's go ahead and read the account that's in Matthew. And what I want you to do when we read it, I want you to pay attention to what leaps out at you. What do you notice in the text? It's always hard to read something fresh when you know it so well. That's always an issue that I have to address in my courses on hermeneutics at school, because there's so many things that we're so familiar with if we've been in the church a long time, familiar with the Bible. It's like, reading the Good Samaritan parable, or the lost son, and various things that we just know so well, we assume that we know all there is to know about it. But I have discovered that if I can kind of disabuse myself of some presuppositions and kind of, step back and try to read it afresh, see what leaps from the page, some themes, some ideas, some things that maybe you haven't noticed before in a close reading of the text. So that's your assignment as I read, and then I'll ask you. Is that okay? Shake your head this way. All right. Matthew 6, verse 5. When you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners so that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But you, when you pray, go into your inner room, close your door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you are praying, do not use meaningless repetitions as the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words. So do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. Pray then in this way: Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For if you forgive others for their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions. You notice I skipped, for yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. It's not all the manuscripts have that. It's kind of spurious. So it's in brackets, probably depending on what Bible you have, translation, they'll note it by footnote and or something like that. So, what got your attention in this text that we just read? What are some things that stood out? Yes? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think, yeah. That's the first thing out of the gate. But it's not just the phrase, hallowed be your name, your name being highly reverenced, is not only something that he's wanting us to verbally say, because there's prayers in the New Testament that don't have that. You see what I'm saying? So this is a guide. What do you think that it's illustrating? Just verbal, or does it have to do with attitude as well? Yeah. So if you look at, when he says, and he's teaching them to pray like this, I think that the first thing that at least pops out in what he says, there's a certain relationship, a certain understanding, certain attitude that seems to be warranted when we are in conversation to God. Now, some may take that as, okay, we got to be real formal. Reverence is formality. So in our prayer, there's a lot of us, because we want to show respect, might slip into a different kind of speaking than we would normally do with anybody else. You'll know what I'm saying? We might slip into thinking that thous and these is a way that we express our reverence to God, and to use, you and yours would be a little less reverent and more personal. That we'll deal with issues like that as we go along, but you're right. The first thing is know who you're talking to. I think is one of the primary things in our prayer. Anybody else? Verse 5. Yeah, sort of like in our courses, Davis, and you've done this too in school, pad of paper, where you make it long as if, you know a lot, but when I read it, it's like a waste of my time because you're not saying anything. I think in the context of what Jesus is saying in regard to hypocrites, what's a hypocrite? Why would he say don't pray like the hypocrites? They're acting for who? So their prayers are not accepted. Jesus says, don't be like them. They're putting on an act. So have we put on an act? Have we caught ourselves not praying to God, but praying to be heard by others? This is one of the things that was problematic. I remember when I was talking about prayer at another congregation where I preached, there was one individual that was totally against any public prayer based upon this idea, praying before men. And I don't think he was right. I think he was too extreme on that, but I understand why he was thinking that, because we could pray to impress, or we could pray, for some other reason, seeking, whatever attitudes we desire or how people would respond to our prayer. That might be our greater emphasis than actually praying to God. So I think, those things are important. The street corners, the Pharisees. Now you have to understand this. From the standpoint of the people, the Pharisees weren't hypocrites. They were the faithful of Israel who were keeping the law. If I wanted my daughter to marry someone, I'd want them to marry a Pharisee, because they were servants of God. They were, they were the model. That's the view that most had of the Pharisees. It's the sorry Sadducees that people had trouble with, because they were the elite class, the ones who ruled, and the Pharisees were protecting the law, and they were standing apart. The etymology of Pharisees is kind of hard to pin, but most seem to think it means to be separated. It's set apart from others. And so when we read it, though, on this side, looking back, we see Matthew 23. You hypocrites, Jesus says. You hypocrites, you do this. Well, that, he exposed, the hypocrisy of a lot of the Pharisees. Now, all Pharisees were hypocrites. I don't think Nicodemus was a hypocrite. But they were viewed by the culture as being the model. I wish I could grow up and be like a Pharisee. That's the sort of idea that the early people had of the Pharisees. So when Jesus says something like this in his ministry, it's shocking. Because most would think how spiritual those Pharisees are when they stand on the corner of the street and they offer prayer. See, everybody would think that they were noble in doing that. And people would want to be like a Pharisee. I wish I could pray like a Pharisee. You ever thought about that when someone prayed? I wish I could pray like that. Well, think of the Pharisee. And I'm not talking about anybody that we've ever said that's a that they're Pharisees. I like to pray like Marshall does, but he's not a Pharisee, okay? He's a good guy. And he's one of my elders. So y'all remember that, okay? So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the Pharisees of the first century. From all practical purposes, were viewed as being good, honorable, spiritual individuals. And Jesus just cracks that egg wide open and dumps the hypocrisy out. So we learn that this is what gets me. Religious people can begin to, how would you say that? Why would the Pharisees, whose movement began as a dedication to God, how could it turn into something other than that? What happened? Any ideas? Pride in what way? That how people thought of them? And so they really liked that. Yeah?
It's an ever-present temptation for anybody that's in a public spot and up before people to start getting in your head, how do I come across to you?
Yeah.
Instead of getting your mind off of
Right,
God.
right, yeah.
Easy.
Yeah. It is a delicate issue. I'll give you, I love what Lads to Leaders does, but there is something that I've found as when I was dean and teacher of preacher students who have been raised in Lads to Leaders. Some of the boys, they come to Faulkner thinking they can preach because they have memorized a 3-minute sermon. So they don't study. They know they can preach because everybody has told them how good they are. And I've had Bible majors in my office start crying when I start to whittle them down a little bit. Because you're not where you need to be. You can't wing it, on your talent and what people have said about you. This is hard work. Because a 3-minute or 5-minute lesson doesn't make you a preacher. That's a good start. But, we start talking about the work that's involved. That's one of the issues. And that can happen to preachers are susceptible in that people automatically will elevate. I mean, we respect our preachers, right? And there's the temptation, if a preacher starts to believe what everybody says and taking it in, then his head might get too big for his shoulders. And that happens. So there's always that danger that we need to be self-aware. And I think that's one of the issues here in remembering, God and reverence his name is to keep us self-aware in our relationship to God. We got to be self-aware. Okay, what else came up in your mind as we read? Yes? Yeah, I'm not saying that the recitation of a prayer, even a model prayer, is something that we wouldn't do or it's not right or whatever. I don't think so at all. The Jews would always, they had 3 times a day. You can see it in Daniel and all this stuff where they had prayer. There were prayers that were recited. They say the Shema every day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God. That's recited daily. I think there's some benefit to that. One of the things that I do is just to remind me is that when I get up in the morning, this is the day that the Lord has made. I try to set my attitude. It doesn't always work, but I want to begin with that thought in mind. So I think sometimes a repetition of things like that can help us stay focused. I wouldn't say that is something we shouldn't do. But in regard to the Pharisees, what's the difference? What were they doing? Meaningless repetitions. What's a meaningless repetition?
I'll give you one. When Brenda was attending Grant Street when she was growing up, there was a guy that would lead prayer, and in his prayer he would say, "Oh Lord, oh Lord." He just periodically through his prayer he'd say that. And whenever he'd get up to pray, her dad would say, "Oh Lord." Hunter's praying.
Well,
He wants coming,
yeah. Well, from the standpoint of the one praying, it may not to him, be a meaningless repetition. I think the motive in regard to it.
He later went to prison, so.
Oh, I know. I don't think he's talking. I don't think he's talking about certain. We have some, as we indicated last time, certain cliche statements that we have in our prayer, and I don't think he's talking about that unless we're not thinking about what we're praying about. I think that's the point. The Pharisees recited things. I mean, you can memorize something and say it, the cliches or whatever, and not have any involvement in prayer. You've just strung along some things, and that's meaningless repetition. That, in other words, it's futile. It doesn't accomplish anything. And I think the reason is why Jesus started with hallowed be your name. The Pharisees have forgotten that first thing. The Pharisees have turned it into a system and have forgotten the person in which.
In Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed the same prayer 3 times.
Yeah.
The same word.
Yeah. So that wasn't meaningless repetition. Why? He's engaged in prayer to the Father. So I think that sort of is the evaluation, not a cliche, God, guard, and direct us, and things like that. Those are perfectly fine as long as we understand that we're praying to God, which is our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Okay. So we had meaningless repetition. They're hypocrites. Yes. Well, I think it depends on the individual and what they want to do. This right here, what Jesus is, he's contrasting. Okay, he's teaching by contrast. He does two extremes. They do public. Okay, what's the purpose for which they're praying publicly? Is it to pray to God or to have the people hear them? It's, to gain the approval of people. So Jesus takes it and goes private, closet. What does that mean? If a person is private, who's the object of their prayer that they're addressing? It's God. See, there's nobody, in a sense, that they're playing to. So he's using that to teach, not to say this is the only way to pray. We shouldn't pray publicly. He's indicating what he says, our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. It's Jesus teaches and others teach by using extremes to show you a contrast. And the contrast is easy to see, isn't it? It's easy to see. And so the component of what's been called the closet prayer, what is the component of it? What makes it acceptable? Yeah, your attitude, your mind, what you're engaged in. Now, it may be helpful for you to go away and pray, like Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane. Sometimes he would go into, the mountain or, away so he can spend some time in prayer. But that doesn't mean that that's the only way that you pray. He's showing a contrast between what the Pharisees do and emphasize and what God wants you to understand in regard to prayer. So I think in answering your question, it would be up to the individual and how they want to model or what they believe would be a good thing. I don't think there's a right or wrong in that. It's your attitudes in check. When you pray, you're giving thanks. If people see you, that's fine. He's not arguing that just because you're seen, then the prayer is not accepted. You're not praying to be seen by others or approved by others. So I think those are some of the things that come into mind. What about, he says, the Gentiles? Here he's talking about, I'm assuming, pagans. So how would pagans pray? Okay. Paganism is full of incantations. You know what I mean by that? It's like, repetitions of a word or a phrase. You try to make, you want to stir up the gods, the spirits. And so through this incantations, repeated things, and dancing around, it's sort of like what happened when Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and how they were acting and trying to get Baal's attention. And Elijah was over here and said, well, if you holler a little bit louder, maybe he'll hear you. You might be a little deaf, And so they started hollering, and then they started cutting themselves, and, you could just see them around a fire or something, going around and mumbling and trying to stir up Baal. And Elijah's, it's a very interesting section. And anyway, you know what I'm talking about. He says maybe Baal is in the restroom. It doesn't come out in English that way, but that's what it's saying in Hebrew. Maybe Baal is he's over here, he's using the bathroom, and you can't bother him right now. And English translations clean up a lot of Hebrew, how should I say it, crass things. It's very visual. And so that's what Elijah is joking about. He's asleep. Maybe he's gone to relieve himself. Maybe he's, doing this and that. Just holler a little louder and cut yourself more. You'll be fine. It's really an interesting section. So Jesus says the meaningless incantations and the wordiness and stringing things, this is not prayer. So he uses that contrast of the person. Notice prayer is very personal, isn't it? It's a conversation with God. It can be public. It can be personal with all of us as God's children. But the reason for the closet is to take it out of that context and show you prayer from an individual. And that it has to do with attitude and our motive and what we think, our heart. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because there's a lot of bargaining prayer in the Old Testament, and we'll address that. Yeah. So it's sort of you do this, God, and I'll be the good person you want me to be. Yeah, that's interesting. He says, "Your kingdom come, your will be done." Now, we know that the kingdom and the church are the same in one way and not in another. What do you mean? Well, we know the kingdom is equated to the church in a lot of passages, which is talking about, God's people being a part of God's kingdom. But the idea of kingdom has to do with reign. And so it depends on how one, are you looking at kingdom as an entity, a church, a body of people in which we are participants in the kingdom? Or is it the idea also we want the reign of God to come, which would be a way in which we express we want people to come to the knowledge of the truth, would be how we would understand it. I think it's a both and kind of situation. I remember going through this and wondering whether we can pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." See, "Thy kingdom come" is explained in the next stanza. What is "thy kingdom come"? It's "thy will be done." So it's God's will being done on earth. And I think it's valid to continue to pray for that because we're praying for God's will to be done. And we know that God's will is done through the church, through the gospel. But you see what I'm asking for? Is for God's will to be known and to be done. So and I know there's some have taken extreme positions and we can't pray that because the church is here, the kingdom is here. But that line is telling you after that, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." That's what we call parallelism. The second line is explaining the first one and what the kingdom means there. So I don't know what your experience has been with that. I remember being rebuked real harshly one time in regard to that, and kind of got me to thinking and studying because I don't want to do anything that's not right or teach anything that's unscriptural. But I think there was a misunderstanding on his part of this particular statement. I do know in Matthew 16 that the kingdom and the church are identified, that he's going to give the apostles the keys to the kingdom. But it has to do with God's will being done. And that's still a sentiment that we want today. And that's the context in which he's saying it here. The will of God being achieved. So I think that's an important topic or thought on our mind in regard to prayer, an idea of prayer. What about, notice, give us this day our daily bread. What's the imagery there? Yeah, bread is a synecdoche for a part representing the whole of provisions. That's what bread indicates. It's a symbol of sustenance. And so we are dependent upon the provisions of God. And yeah, Thomas, the Bible is our bread of life, you know. Man shall not live by bread alone. Now, the thing about what he's saying here is the way people survived in the first century was on daily work. You know, if you didn't work one day, you got nothing for that day, and your family didn't eat that day if you didn't have anything that day. See what I'm saying? It was a daily thing. And also, it probably has some allusions back in the Old Testament during the wilderness wanderings and that interesting food that I would love to have seen called manna. And they were taught to go out and collect the manna, only enough that they needed for that day. And if they tried to hoard it up, it would spoil. So God was teaching them to rely on Him for their provisions on a daily basis. Now, that's some kind of faith, isn't it? How many times do we get so worried about things? You know, this is a part of the model prayer that I think is hitting at the core of our trust, our daily walk, our daily trust with God. So, give us this day our daily bread. Then, what about 12? And forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. What does debts represent? Do what? Trespasses. Yeah, it's sins, but it's interesting that the word debt is used. Sin is pictured like a debt that you can't repay. You know, it's like being so deep in debt, there's no way that you can get yourself out of it. And so it represented trespasses and sins. It's like a debt, a weight, a burden on you. And if you've had in your life financial problems, which probably a lot of us have had through the years, of indebtedness to where it affects your emotions and, you know, how you are and everything, it's just can be a burden. Well, that's sort of the metaphor of the transgressions and sins. So not only forgiving our debts, which God has done in Jesus, but what about the transgressions and debts of others against you? That's always been the standard, that we are to be the same in attitude as God has been toward us. You know, you remember the parable that's told about this guy who's a servant of the king, had owed so much, there's no way in his lifetime he could ever pay it back. And so he threw himself at the mercy of the king, and the king forgave the debt. And then the next day he sees someone walking by that he, you know, lent a few, you know, pesos to or whatever. And he grabbed him by the neck and said, "You repay me." And the guy threw himself at that servant who had been forgiven and pleaded for his life, and he threw him in prison. Well, they got back to the king. You remember what the king said, right? What did the king say? What was the lesson? Shouldn't you have forgiven him like I had forgiven you? Then they threw him out until he can pay the very last cent. And what that meant, he would be in prison for a long time. So, and do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. You know, temptation and test are the same word, depending on what the context is in which we find it. God doesn't solicit people to sin. Okay? He doesn't do that. And Book of James says that by our own lust we are, tantalized by temptation and we go into sin. So, the idea of not leading us into temptation, what do you understand that to be? What are you asking of God? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's a way. It's asking for deliverance and protection. It's like if this is a test, help me pass the test. If I'm facing a temptation, help me avoid the temptation. And so it is the recognition of God actually having the ability, providentially, through his word that he's given, to help us overcome temptation. So God's pretty personal then and pretty specific in his relationship in our lives, I would think, right? So, verse 14. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. Or help me see the way of escape. No temptation has overcome one that is such, that is common to man, but with the temptation there's a what? A way of escape. So, help us to see that way. Sometimes when we're tempted, we're not looking for the way out. We're being drawn by our own lust in to the temptation. For if you forgive others for their transgressions, your heavenly Father will forgive you. What do you think about that standard? That's a, it is a standard that we have to consider because it is a practical thing too. Jesus said, pray for your enemies. Well, some of the psalmists prayed for the enemies, but they prayed that they might be destroyed and their kids' heads bashed against the stones. We're going to look at some of those. They're called imprecatory. Some prayers and psalms that are laments have some things to say. But if you don't forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions. Okay, Luke 11, we have basically the same thing, but here, a little bit different in context. There's some additions in Luke. If you'll look at verse 5 and following, he says, then he said to them, suppose one of you has a friend and goes to him at midnight and says to him, friend, lend me 3 loaves, for a friend of mine has come to me from a journey and I have nothing to set before him. And from inside he answers and said, do not bother me. The door has already been shut and my children and I are in bed. I cannot get up and give you anything. I tell you, even though he will not get up and give him anything because he is his friend, yet because of his persistence, he will get up and give him as much as he needs. This is an interesting story. The man is called the man's friend. because he won't get up because it's his friend. And the only reason he does get up is because the guy won't stop knocking on the door. So he finally has to get in, give in, because he's going to wake everybody up and all this stuff. Then he contrasts that with God. What's the lesson? God's not like that, where you pray and God's saying, I got more important things to do than to listen to your puny old little problems. That's not God. I'm busy, That's not God. And we'll take up that. So 2 more passages to look at. So you're through. We're through. Shalom.